Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is George Wuerthner. George Wuerthner is an ecologist and an expert on predators, especially in wolf restoration. He is the former Ecological Project Director for the Foundation for Deep Ecology, and he is currently the editor of Public Lands Media. George is the author of 38 books on environmental issues and hundreds of articles, many published in the Wildlife News, that I personally find to be among the best I have read in recent years. He received the Grassroots Activist of the Year award from the Fund for Wild Animals in 2017. A true leader of the environmental movement, if there ever was one. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Glenn. One slight correction. It was from the Fund for Wild Nature.
Okay, got it. Would you like to make introductory comments?
No, I think maybe the best thing is just to kind of see where you want me to go by asking a few questions from your end, and I'll try to see if I can give you an adequate answer, or at least go from there to something else.
Okay. Question number one. How do you assess the state of the environmental movement in America at this moment?
I don't know what the right adjective is, but it's basically not in good shape in my view. And let me explain why that is. It has, in many cases, tried to be too broad in the things that any organization sees as its mission, and that, of course, tends to dilute your effectiveness when you're trying to maintain relationships with an incredible diversity of goals and objectives. The second thing I see as a problematic issue, and this may not be current, it may be all along, but I'm aware of it, is many people in the environmental movement don't have a good sense of the history of past campaigns and goals and events. And, of course, the old line that failure to know history, you repeat those failures again. And so the lack of understanding of what has happened in the past, who was responsible for maybe things that today we take for granted, is, I think, hampers the ability to move forward effectively. And a third thing that I think has happened to the environmental movement is, and this is sort of related to the first issue I mentioned, is in particular, there has been a growing segment of it that seems to be more concerned with social justice than with, you might say, ecological justice and ecosystem justice. And that's not to say that social justice is not of it. It's a very valid issue that people, I believe, should pay attention to and be involved in. But there are, the thing that I see is there's a lot of groups that do that already, and therefore, and very few groups working on conservation issues to the degree that, comparatively speaking, to these other political entities. And so if you're spending a whole lot more time on the social justice issues, you're taking away time, money, and personnel from advocacy for conservation issues. And they're of course interrelated, because a lot of the hardship from degraded environment most affects people who have little power or money, etc. So I'm not saying that there isn't a connection, but I am saying that we could use some more people working towards conserving biodiversity, dealing with wildlands preservation and other issues like that used to be, in many cases, the main focus of a lot of these groups.
Okay, well, I have some questions that will let us get back to some of the things you mentioned there. But for now, let me go on to my second question. I know you are an advocate for large-scale wilderness protection and rewilding across North America and around the world. Do you think that identifying areas of land and water across America that have wilderness characteristics, protecting them, and linking them to one another is still the best strategy for saving life on Earth?
Well, I do, and I want to define things a little bit in that what we're trying to protect by wilderness designation, national parks, and other preserves is ecological evolutionary processes that have created the biodiversity that we see across the world. And there's, the more practical end of that, which a lot of people use, is, biodiversity and stable ecosystem function benefits humans. And that's certainly true. I'm not going to doubt that. But then there's also the larger issue is, do humans have a right to totally disrupt across the whole planet these evolutionary processes, particularly when they lead to species extinction, ecosystem degradation, and so forth. And, depending upon what statistics you want to use, it's pretty easy to show that humans already have modified a good percentage of the planet, 70 to 80% by different definitions. And so that makes the remaining areas that are still largely influenced or what some of us call self-willed lands, largely influenced by natural processes, they are even rarer and therefore more valuable and should be given preservation and protection for that reason. There's a whole lot of science that shows when protected areas get too small, too fragmented, you start losing a lot of species because a species will wink out in some area. And when you have connected corridors and large protected areas, then those places where the species have winked out are likely to be recolonized again from these other areas. But if you fragment the landscape enough and modify it enough, then that kind of recolonization can happen, which of course hastens even more species extinctions or at least local extirpation of those species. Okay. And so anyway, I just think there's a moral, ethical aspect to this.
Clear enough. You have said that public lands are part of our nation's inheritance. Should they all become designated wilderness for the sake of biodiversity and moral citizenship?
I would say a lot more of the public lands could be done. I don't know if all of them have to be, but the main point is to try to minimize our footprint upon those landscapes. And of course, critics of my perspective will sometimes say, well, humans have totally modified the whole earth. Okay, climate change is happening everywhere. That's a good example. And that's absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that the degrees of modification are the same everywhere. And there are a lot of parts of the continent where you can go and show that, for the most part, the influences on the landscape in those areas are mostly natural, not human imprint. Or the human imprint has a smaller effect there. And so they're not the same geographically. So someplace like New York City and Manhattan Island is clearly a very human-modified landscape and domesticated landscape. But you can go up to the Brooks Range in Alaska, a place I've spent a lot of time in, and you know, I would say for the most part, the Brooks Range is still being modified largely by natural evolutionary processes, and therefore deserves to be given some protection so that those evolutionary processes can continue.
Are you in favor of terminating all livestock leases on public lands immediately, which Jonathan Radner told me can be done legally tomorrow?
Yeah, I'd be all for that, yes. And one of the reasons, let me explain my reasoning, is it goes broadly beyond even public lands, but the largest, when we're talking about the human footprint, particularly in the western United States, the largest human footprint comes from livestock production. And I have to define that livestock production so people have a clear image of it. It's much more than just the cropping of grass by some domestic animal like a cow. It's everything that goes into producing livestock. And that includes things, particularly in the West, like dewatering rivers to create irrigated alfalfa fields or pastures, or shooting predators like wolves and grizzly bears and mountain lions to protect the livestock. It has to do with the loss of soil that trampling of the soil and loss of vegetation exposes, and so forth. So these are things that go beyond just simply the grazing of plants. And there's nothing that has a bigger impact, particularly, again, in the western United States, than the livestock production. And therefore, particularly on public lands, I don't think you can find any kind of justification for it if you looked at the full accounting of the ecological and economic costs. Because, when you do things like, for example, withdraw water from a river, you're affecting things like the aquatic ecosystems, which therefore affects things like fishing opportunities for fishermen. And in a lot of places in the West, fishing is a big part of the local tourist economy. So I'm just using that as an example of how livestock production has other economic costs beyond just the ecological costs, which are numerous.
Okay. So it was hard for me to get some accurate figures for my next question, so I had to just sort of estimate. But let's say, for the sake of this question, that roughly between 30 and 50% of Western ranches depend economically on public lands, maybe 10,000 ranches, just ballpark figure. If all of these leases were canceled tomorrow, what is the best way of dealing with these ranching families? Do you think there should be something akin to a guaranteed income, or what would you say to this question?
I certainly wouldn't give them a guaranteed income. I would make the argument that they should be paying us for all the damage that's been done over the years, compensation to the public. But given political realities, there's a thing out there called the Voluntary Grazing Permit Retirement Act, which would pay ranchers on public lands a fee based on their forage usage of the public lands forage, and in many cases that would amount to a significant amount of money. And you gotta remember another thing. We have this thing about the poor rancher all the time, so that's the narrative that's out there. But the average rancher in the West is far richer than the average Westerner by far, simply because property in the West is valuable. Even crummy ranch land is often worth thousands of dollars per acre. And if you've got a 1,000-acre or 2,000-acre ranch, you already are a multimillionaire by anyone's definition. Now, granted, it's tied up in the land, but that's what most people say. My own self, my most valuable asset I have is my house, So my property is my main financial, you might say, reserve, and that's how it is for many ranchers. And so their ability to, there's all kinds of things. If you were to cancel public land things, some of these ranchers would simply continue to ranch using their private lands and modify the ranching operation to fit the private land segment, or they might buy up other private land, or they may choose to maybe even sell off their land and do some other thing with their land that's maybe more valuable. For example, in places like Oregon, California, and other places like that, a lot of ranch land has been converted into vineyards because wine is a higher value crop that can be grown often on the same landscape that once supported domestic livestock. So there's, just the economic benefits for having cleaner water, less species extinction. Carbon, cows are a major source of methane and the gases that are driving climate change. The costs of managing these lands, public management of those lands are often much higher than what the ranchers pay in fees. So that's a net loss to taxpayers. So we go on and on and on with all kinds of costs that are out there that would be avoided or eliminated by simply canceling grazing fees on public lands. And in my view, there really isn't. You could give me any argument the ranchers give you for why they should continue to graze. I'll give you one is, we prevent subdivisions, and because as long as we're grazing our public lands, we can keep our private lands intact. And if we can't get at the public lands, we'll have no choice but to sell our private lands for subdivisions. Well, I'll just go into that one for one thing. For one thing, not every place will be subdivided because nobody wants to live there. There's not flocks of people moving to North Dakota, for example, or parts of Nevada desert. And if you were to have a ranch go up for sale, and the likelihood of it being subdivided and sold for that is very slim. The other part of that whole equation assumes that, again, that there's no other alternative. Like I said, some ranchers would continue grazing on their private lands, but much to the detriment of the landscape, by the way, but could continue that way. And a final thing, even in that whole argument, is that, I go to places like the Gallatin Valley, which in Montana was where Bozeman's located. And if you fly over it, you see some subdivisions, but the vast amount of the landscape is covered by agriculture, mostly hay fields and pastures and wheat fields. And those are biological deserts compared. Even your typical subdivision has more wildlife in it. I live in a little lot here, and I have, I've got quail here. I've got all kinds of bird species. I've got squirrels. I've got rabbits. I have salamanders. I have had deer, skunks, raccoons. I could go on and on. Native bees, native butterflies, all kinds of species that grow in my little lot. And then if you put the combined wildlife diversity and abundance across my whole part of my town, it would, on a comparison basis with, say, an alfalfa field, we'd have 100 times more species in abundance than a similar area devoted to, livestock alfalfa growing. And so even the assertion that open space is the same as good wildlife habitat is incorrect. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm an advocate for a lot of subdivisions. I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that if you look at things from a realistic point of view, you're failing to account to all the ways that the livestock industry is destroying and degrading things. And if you did such accounting, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that we should be continuing it. And by the way, I can extend that from the West. If you put in all the cropland across the Midwest, the corn and the soybeans in particular that are being grown mostly to feed livestock, and you put in the pastures that are across all the way to the East Coast, mostly for livestock. And when I'm talking about livestock, I'm talking mostly about cattle and dairy cows, not, goats or something like that. And if you put all that land together, it's about 1 billion acres. 1 billion acres of the United States is devoted to growing livestock in one form or another. That's a huge, huge impact. And anything we can do to reduce that impact would have significant repercussions, both economically and ecologically, in a positive fashion.
Well, thanks for that comprehensive answer. I know your essay, Cows versus Condos, and I recommend it to everybody. You
Good,
have said that more acquisition of private land, especially in the Midwest and eastern United States, is required by the federal government to protect biodiversity. What do you think of using the right of eminent domain by the federal government to buy out at fair market prices private land where this land is needed for the common good, just as the government forces people to sell when it authorizes a highway or some other infrastructure project?
Well, that's exactly what my point would be, is that when we see a public good is the end result of this kind of a use of eminent domain, then it is justified. And it's interestingly, we justify all the time destroying natural places with hydro dams, using eminent domain to be able to build hydro dams or to build flood valleys and build highways and all these other things that destroy nature. It would seem to me it would be reasonable to expect to do this for preserving nature too. And I recognize that would be not a very popular thing for most people, and politically may be difficult to get widespread support for, or at least to implement it widely. But, we could start slowly and focus on really key parcels of land that fit into a bigger matrix of protected landscapes, like a place where it might be an important corridor for wildlife to migrate. And if it were key parcels there, that might be a place where you'd want to use eminent domain on behalf of nature to protect the larger complex of wildlife migration habitat. So yeah, I'm a real advocate of that. I realize a lot of these things, of course, requires a whole change in public attitude. And how do you get there? I think the way you get there is by doing things like we're doing right now, is just you throw out ideas, you try to educate the public with justifications and rationales. And I take a long-term view on a lot of this stuff, because if you look at our history of political change in this country or any country, it's usually a gradual thing, maybe punctuated historical political change, you might say. In other words, you have a long time where not much happens, and then you have something significant happen. And I always use the civil rights movement in America, going from slavery as a justifiable and legitimate right, and ownership of other people, to our Civil War, where we tried to eliminate and outlaw slavery, but we still had a lot of discrimination. Then we gradually got up through the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, and since that time have worked even more so to improve conditions so there's less and less discrimination. It has been more broadly applied. Originally the civil rights was seen to mostly have to do with human race issues. And, then it gets broadened to things like, well, what about the rights of people who are, gay couples want to get married or something like that. So it has gotten expanded, and we see the same thing happening even to a degree in the natural world. There's been this whole thing where, the idea of certain kinds of things that kill wildlife are outlawed. You can't take dynamite, throw it in a river, and blow it up and kill all the fish. That's kind of like a war crime kind of event. And so we've been expanding our definition of what's suitable rights and who has them and how they should be implemented. And I feel like that may take time, but with that change, we hopefully will get to be a greater support and understanding for things like maybe eminent domain on behalf of nature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You have said, and I quote you, many people may have to move because wildlife must be given priority, end quote. Now, I'll just make a comment, and if you would respond to it. It seems to me that there are so many private inholdings within designated wilderness areas and within de facto wilderness area that humans and their activities need to move out of these areas if we are going to establish a real wilderness preservation system in America. So your response?
Well, yes, within a context, that is, I would want to see, fair compensation. And of course there may be arguments against what's fair and not fair. But just as I said, the same thing happens when we build a highway or we put in a new school or other public facilities. And sometimes people do have to move out of the way to another area. Hopefully, they're compensated sufficiently so that such a move beyond maybe the emotional attachment one might have to that particular place, which I understand is real, but that they can adequately find a suitable place, replacement for what they had that is being used for the wildlife at that point. And it's, again, this is all it's not absolutism in any way. It's trying to find a way to accommodate these things with the least conflict as possible. That's why I say fair compensation is a really important part about it, and an understanding of how for people it may be difficult for them emotionally to give up the place. So you might do something like, okay, we're going to pay you now for your property, and when you die, this becomes public lands at that point. So you get to live there the rest of your life. We're not going to kick you out of here, and we'll give you a chance to live there and finish out your life there. I mean, those are ways that you can kind of address some of these issues. I can see myself if I were living someplace, and been there all my life, and somebody came along and said, "Hey, you got to move out so we can, I don't know, have a deer winter range there." They'd say, "Well, the hell with the deer, this is where I want to be." And those are realistic issues that one has to deal with. But I don't think they're impossible, and certainly there are enough analogs to how we work around these kinds of things for all sorts of other purposes that we can learn from that and use it hopefully for helping nature have a place that it can survive as well.
An excellent idea.
Well, the thing is, in many cases, one of the great things about human beings is we're a really adaptable species, and which is one of the reasons why we've been so prolific. And we've adapted ourselves from the Arctic to the tropical rainforests and deserts and all kinds of lands in between, and part of that. But for a lot of other species, they don't have that resilience or ability to adapt, and so it is my hope that the human species, if not individually but as a whole, can grow enough to see that we have an obligation and a need to apply some sort of ecological justice to the planet's other inhabitants, which is a whole lot more than just humans and our livestock, and they've given up a lot already to accommodate us and and our agriculture. So,
what a great way to put it. So, you have written about, quote, getting back to the right landscape, end quote. Is the pre-European landscape the best benchmark or ideal?
Well, I think that can be a trap in a way. In general, I would say that's a good start. But what you really want to preserve is not some particular point in historic time as much as the evolutionary and ecological processes that drive, species diversity and ecosystem diversity and function. And because we're dealing with a whole set of new things. I mean, the climate isn't the same now as it was 100 or 200 years ago. So you'd be wasting a lot of time if you were trying to restore an area to the plants and animals that may have existed there hundreds of years ago, much less something like the Ice Age. So we have to recognize that these bigger geological, climatic, and other events that shape the land also change what your standard is. But if you're using the standard of trying to preserve those processes that drive natural areas, then that makes it a little easier because it doesn't mean that everything stays the same. It's a recognition that change is part of these areas, and that what we want is to preserve the changes that are primarily of a non-human origins, and I think there's room for that on the planet, hopefully, and also room for that in our minds and hearts.
Mm-hmm. You have said, quote, environmentalists need to start discussions maintaining that a healthy ecosystem is a higher priority than the private use of our land and water. This touches on socialism, or at least a critique of capitalism, because it privileges or enshrines property rights into the Constitution. Is this what you are getting at? And do you think that some socialist ideas are useful in developing a new and better human lifestyle?
Well, I'll start out by saying, in general, I don't see a better system than capitalism, but it has its limitations, and that needs to be recognized. And it needs sidebars and regulation, and it needs to have values put into it that recognizes that that the property is something that we all appreciate. I certainly do. I'm glad I own my house, but that we all collectively also are members of the planetary natural systems, and that those planetary natural systems need to be preserved. And there are, in a sense, you're talking about socialism. Of course, like if you, by the definition, of at least a lot of people would understand socialism, that is, there's no particular owner or something. Our public lands are socialism, and national parks, national forests, BLM lands, state parks, etc., city parks. These are examples of shared landscapes that we, if you want to put it in terms of ownership, we either all own or maybe nobody owns. You could say it either way, and so they have great value for everybody. One of the really great things about America is our public lands. I think, if you want to talk about what features of America promotes democracy and democratic principles, public lands are it. Nobody is exclusively excluded from our public lands because of race or religion or wealth or whatever. And I see this all the time. I mean, I'll just tell you stories. I go to Yellowstone Park a lot. It's one of my favorite places. And, people are there watching wolves or grizzly bears or something. And you see all these people line up there. And they're all enjoying watching these animals. And I guarantee you, if you were to find out anything about them, you'd find some of them are, probably multimillionaires, and others are maybe on food stamps, just barely surviving. You would find that some of them are well-educated PhDs, and others never graduated high school. Some of them are super conservative, Trump supporters, and others are like Bernie Sanders or whatever. The point being is you're all there at the same time, and you have none of those labels on you because you're all focused on the public lands because it's available to us. And how many places do we have where we all intermix like that? We're all in our little, tribal places all the time that we hardly even meet these people from other economic, racial, religious, backgrounds and so forth. And public lands are one of those great features. And I recognize one of the arguments of the social justice movement is that, that a lot of places are not available to lower income people or certain racial minorities. And I'm all for improving that situation by making more public lands and making them more easily available, whether that means that I don't particularly like the fact you got to pay to go on public lands like in some national parks, for example. But there are ways to broaden that democratic opportunity. And that is one of the great things about the United States and America. And frankly, it's caught on around the world. So national parks and preserves are now a feature of most countries in the world. And they can be seen as one of the great kind of ideas that developed in the United States as elsewhere and have been exported. And some say, the really social justice warrior type, some of them are very much down on public lands and parks and stuff. And I would just say that they need to take a different look at public lands and how it has the opportunity. Maybe it's not living up fully to expectations any more than we have civil rights, 100% in this country. But at least we're trying. And I think that that's an important perspective to keep in mind is that we, the situation, I'll use the civil rights in the United States, that it has gotten better from, 100 years ago, from 200 years ago, when, in fact, back during the Revolutionary War time, if you were a Southern slave owner, you would be thrown in jail if you freed your slaves. It was against the law to do that because they feared about slave uprising. So we've gone from making it illegal to free slaves to completely illegal to have slaves. That's a huge shift. Mm-hmm. And so I see national parks, preserves, and other public lands as a very critical part of our democratic institutions.
Research by Rebecca Melnick showed that Proposition 127 in Colorado, which would have banned the trophy hunting of mountain lions and the unlimited trapping of bobcats. Her research showed that failed to pass because the majority of people voted against what was called ballot box biology, preferring instead that scientists and experts make such decisions. So I know that the agencies don't make a lot of their decisions based on good science, but rather they base them on politics and money. But it raises the issue of what you were just talking about, the relationship of democracy and ecology. So my question is, should someone with genuine expertise in ecology contribute differently to a land use decision than someone whose family farms the land?
My answer would be no. It would be what I would hope is that the person with the expertise could make adequate arguments that convinces people why whatever the management decision that's being promoted is in the best interest of the wildlife, as well as perhaps even in the best interest of most of society. I think that, forcing stuff doesn't work real well. So it's better to try to work on your education output. Now, things like political referendums are a way to educate, because you have to, get out there to the voters and say, well, why do you want to have this referendum passed or opposed, whatever it may be? So that, sometimes a referendum can be a form of education and sort of the foundation for future legislation by the representatives of the people, that is the governor and legislature, to change. Now, your point about how there's a lot of bias out there and political influence is a good one. And that's part of the problem. Years ago, I was looking at the makeup of the politics in Montana at that time. And I found that in the state legislature, they had to list what their occupation was. And I found that 55% of the state legislators at that time listed their occupation as agriculture, ranchers or farmers. And yet ranchers and farmers made up 1% of Montana's population at that time. And it was even more stunning to look at county commissioners around Montana. At that time, 77% of the county commissioners were in agriculture. And so I was like, why is this? Well, there were some actually institutional situations that favored agriculturalists in the legislature and county. For one, for example, in Montana, the legislature meets in the winter for about 3 months. Now, who has time to take off from their job for 2 or 3 months and be in the legislature? Well, for most farmers and ranchers in Montana, winter is a slow time of year. They're not planting crops, or they're not, they're just feeding cows at the home ranch, throwing out some hay there. So it's the kind of thing that you could reasonably see getting away from occasionally to be in Helena as part of the legislature. Whereas, if you were a school teacher and you said to the school, hey, I want to take off 3 months and I'm going to go over to the legislature, they tell you, well, you better find a different job. So that institutional bias selected for people that had that freedom, which a lot of people in agriculture had. And, of course, that got started back in the day when in Montana, probably 90% of the people who were first settling there, the white people there, were in farming and ranching. So it's no wonder that got adopted, and it just hasn't changed. So we have you have an inherent bias in Montana towards agricultural interests, which is why, for example, we'll use an issue you've raised, wolves. There's a very harsh treatment of wolves in terms of trapping and hunting in the state of Montana, where the general policy is try to limit wolf populations as much as possible by hunting them and making very generous opportunities. In other words, tag limits, you can kill, X amount of wolves a year to a single person. I don't know what the take is right now, but, you got a long season when you can kill them and all these things. And so, why do they have that? If you talk to most wolf biologists who really understand wolf behavior, and so they will tell you that doing that has many social disruptions of wolf society, so to speak, wolf ecology. And in fact, those disruptions of wolf ecology and social interactions often leads to more conflicts with humans, which is the whole justification given for having, very lenient wolf killing policies in Montana. So if you were talking about the experts like you're talking about before, the real experts on wolf biology, most of them would agree that it's unnecessary to kill that many wolves and that it actually may backfire on you by creating more conflicts. And I won't go into all the science behind that, but,
okay,
but
yeah,
there's science.
let me stop you there, if I might, because I have 40 questions here. We're on question 11.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you this question, which will allow you to continue what you were just saying and what you were saying beforehand. Do you think it is a waste of time to collaborate about public lands with ranchers, miners, loggers, and others who have an economic interest in exploiting these public lands?
Well, I mean, to me, that's a real obvious conflict of interest. If we're talking about the public good, and the public good is not defined as what's the economic good of just a segment of society, then that gives undue influence to those that have an economic reason to be involved. And I've seen this over and over again as parts of collaboratives where it influences the kinds of questions that are even asked. For example, I was in a grazing collaborative in Montana, and I went to the first couple of meetings, and it was decided that they were going to collaborate on where, how much grazing was going to happen. And I stopped. I tried to raise the issue. I said, well, how about we start a little before that and ask whether we should be grazing here at all? Well, that was an issue that nobody in the collaborative wanted to go into, mostly because most of the people at the collaborative were ranchers, and then a few, compromising conservationists. But that's the kind of thing that you should be asking, yet it was totally off the table. Mm-hmm. And so that's what happens when you get the economic interest in there as part of the collaboratives. And especially, there's a sort of another example of how it can have an unusual effect. If you have, I've been on forestry collaboratives as well, and I remember one meeting where there was like 25 of us sitting around. We all had to identify why we were there, and everybody there, with my exception, was in some way connected with cutting timber, whether it was Forest Service employees, timber company representatives, etc. And so, even though, from a democratic point of view, if there was a question or a discussion, I was able to raise my hand and make a point, but I couldn't dominate the meeting because there were 24 other people, and they all had the other perspective. Mm-hmm. So my perspective didn't really have much value or influence because it was already sort of determined in a way by the makeup of the collaborative. So those are the problems with collaboratives.
Okay. And, I'm going to ask you another question. I know these are big and difficult questions, but you have so many powerful ideas in your essays that I'm trying to give you an opportunity to at least say something about these important ideas. So, can you explain what you mean by the Indian Iron Curtain?
Yes. It's part of a social justice movement where, because of many, well-documented examples of where tribal people, across the world actually, but in our own country, have been treated poorly with their interactions with the dominant society, whoever it happens to be, that there is a tendency to both overly villainize the dominant society and minimize the minority society that's may be doing things of equally abusive or equally as unfair to others, or have done so in the past, and an unwillingness to discuss what they are. And in a more current issue, as I'll just give you some examples here to make the point of what I'm trying to say. There's a whole lot of environmental groups that are trying to prevent oil drilling on the Arctic coast of Alaska and places like the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. I'm all for that. I don't want to see drilling there either. However, the whole issue ignores the fact you won't hear conservation groups mentioning that the people who live on the coast of Alaska, the Arctic coast, which the broader name for that group is Eskimos, and they have their own subnames, but most people know them as Eskimos. Most Eskimo communities there want to see oil drilling because they make almost all their income from oil well royalties and, working on oil rigs and that sort of thing. And that almost never gets mentioned. It's always the evil oil companies want to drill there, as if there's, and then if there's anybody who's opposed at all that can be identified as a tribal member, they're giving a lot of attention when it doesn't really represent the view of the majority of Native people there. That's what I mean by Iron Curtain. A fair representation would be saying, well, these people want to see oil drilling too. There's no reason to still allow oil drilling, in my view. But it certainly changes maybe your perspective on what is being proposed there, and makes it a harder issue too, because frankly, a lot of those Eskimo communities are pretty poor places, a lot of poverty, and so. You can make an argument from a social justice perspective that we should be drilling oil there for their sake because they get this money from it, and not worry about the ecological impacts.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I mean, I think you bring forth a lot of evidence in your various essays on the Wildlife News to support what you're saying. But just to be clear, and I want to make sure I understand you. You think that it is largely a myth that Native people around the globe live in harmony with the land?
Yes, I would say that there's a misinterpretation of you can generally make the argument that there has been a lower impact of tribal people globally, including the ancestors of Asians and Europeans and Africans, because of low population and low technology. And as all of those things, both population and technology, have increased, the ecological impact of any group has increased. And, tribal people, at least in North America, have opportunities and access to technology, and their population is growing too. But the main point is, when you can, the only way you can cut down a tree is with a stone axe. You're not going to have a lot of clear cuts. So, so they say, look at the, such and such tribe lived in harmony with the forest because there were no clear cuts. But give them a chainsaw and they can do the same thing as anybody else. And that, in fact, does happen on tribal lands. And so it's sort of the dishonest representation to suggest that tribal people, for the most part, are any different than any other group and never have been, including our own ancestors. My ancestors come from Northern Europe, and as we got more technology and stuff, our impact grew larger and larger. So basically what I'm saying is that tribal people, for the most part, are no different than any other humans, and it's to look at it as if they have some sort of genetic or even strong cultural traits that make them more superior and likely to be protect landscape or the environment is probably wishful thinking. And here's an important distinction, because there are examples we can find where tribal people support things of an environmental nature, but what you find is usually in those cases they don't have a direct vested interest in the financial, particularly in the outcome. So, for example, some of the tribes around the Grand Canyon do not want to see uranium mining. Great. I like that. But none of them own the land. But in places where they own mineral rights, whether it's copper or coal or oil, they're just as happy to sell that land for development as anybody else because they control it and they get a vested interest. So you got to be real careful and say, do they have some sort of and it's really not any different than most of us. I can't say that if I had 40 acres with a couple of with oil underneath it, and the oil companies came to me and say, "Hey, we'll give you a couple of $1 million to lease your land for oil development." I like to think I would say no, but people can rationalize things and come up with some reason why. You could say, "Oh, okay, I'm going to lease that for that oil, and then I'm going to take that millions of dollars, and I'm not going to keep it for myself. I'm going to donate it to, the Center for Biodiversity or whatever to help them fight more lawsuits." And, people can rationalize things in a lot of ways. And all I'm saying is that be careful of making broad assumptions about the environmental ethics of tribal people that's any different than anybody else.
Okay. You think, if I understand you correctly, that so-called conservation organizations are intimidated by the social justice movement because most conservation groups are funded by progressive foundations advocating social justice issues. So I think you say that conservation advocacy is being weakened by the social justice movement. Your response?
Well, yeah, and I would also say that most people who work for conservation groups tend to be of a liberal persuasion, political liberalism, which has strong, basic support for just social justice movements in general. And I'm saying, if you ask me, I'm all for civil rights, for example. And I would consider myself a liberal politically and on issues like that. And so are most people that work in the conservation movement. So what we have is a subset of the people who actually get jobs there, plus the influence, as you mentioned, of foundations, which also tend to be made up of politically liberal people, all putting out this policy of trying to push the social justice agenda. And as I explained real early on, I think that sometimes can dilute effectiveness because, in some cases, you get to this situation where you're willing to condemn say clear-cut logging by the Forest Service, but if a tribe clear cuts most of its reservation, and I can send you pictures of all kinds of reservations around the West where some of the worst clear cuts I've ever seen exist, but nobody mentions that, and they don't bring that kind of thing up because that would they'd be afraid of being accused of being insensitive, racist, or whatever.
Right.
And
I get your
so
point.
that winds up. Yeah, that tends to be inhibit the honesty of what's going on.
Yep. In your essay, I think it's called the Indian Iron Curtain, gives hundreds of examples of what you're saying here. Thank you, George, for a wealth of ideas that make you one of the most important voices for Earth alive today, in my opinion.
Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate the opportunity to, explore some of these ideas with you.
And I'll be talking to you again.
Sounds very good. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations with my guest, George Wuerthner, on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number.